heart today is that together we can understand better the missional environment that we're in, that we can grow in confidence and a sense of agency and authority in Christ to work with God in what he's doing in our time. And like David is reported in the scriptures, we want to be those who serve the purpose of God in our generation. What does this generation, this moment, call forth and require of us? 10 years ago, in an address to the Italian church, the late Pope Francis said, "We're not living in an era of change so much as a change of era." And Sarah and I agree with this statement. But how do we understand it? What are its implications? We believe that we are approaching a societal threshold. That is a change from one era to a new one. And as we approach this societal threshold, there's a great deal of tumult, confusion, noise, contention in the environment. We're clear that though there are massive cultural changes taking place, the unchanging gospel remains good news. And so the questions we want to explore today concern how we lead, how we follow Jesus, how we seek the kingdom and proclaim the gospel in such a context. Now, throughout the day, we will consider 7 major metaphors to help us explore these questions. The threshold itself, a metaphor, revolution, exile, baggage, the climate, urgency, and rebuilding. So we start by naming our context as a threshold moment. When we cross a threshold, a doorway, a portal, there is an acceleration of change. Change is not always linear. So to name our context as a threshold moment is to identify something weighty, something that needs particular attention, something of gravity, something that is not usually reversible. And the term threshold is one that we've taken from this book by John O'Donoghue, Benedictus, a book of blessings. He describes in it a threshold as a significant shift from one season to another. It represents the kind of change that we both fear and desire. To cross the threshold, O'Donoghue tells us, doesn't happen by accident if it's to be successful. It requires intentionality. Now, we want to think today in 3 registers. O'Donoghue's approach is aimed mainly at our personal lives, but we will extend his approach to think also about the corporate, the organizational or community register, and also the societal register. Because as Christians, we all too easily neglect these other registers and focus solely on the personal. These are some major threshold moments in the Bible. These are moments of major transition from one era to another. And in all of these, the paradigm for leadership, for community organization, and for social culture changed significantly. So each of these can be instructive for us in reflecting on the challenges we face today. We will not go into detail on all of these things. You'll hear us drawing on elements of these, but all of them you might want to mine and resource, and probably already you are in the moment we're in. Now, O'Donoghue gives 5 questions that we can answer to help us be missional and intentional about the threshold that's before us. And we're going to consider each of these questions during our time together. The first question asks, at which threshold are we now standing? Because we need to understand what kind of landscape are we in.
It's so good to be here. I have to be careful that I don't start chatting. I'll get told off by my husband. Okay. Let me begin with a statement. We'll go straight in and carry on from what we're already thinking about. The way we interpret our context directly impacts the way we act within it. So I'm glad that we're here, taking time to stop our frenetic activity, to spend time very deliberately thinking about our context, so that we can act within it with faith, with boldness, and with intentionality, rather than becoming victims of our context. Now, historians like me like to divide time up into chunks, periods, as we call them. And a time period is just a cluster of distinctive characteristics, economic, social, political, that together form a distinct mentality. So distinct that it can be distinguished from the time that preceded it, and then one day from the time which will succeed it. And the movement between time periods, transitions, thresholds, if you like, they are usually tumultuous. And we've already used that word tumult, and I think it's going to come up. It's a word which captures, doesn't it, our moment really well. The shaking, the vortex that we feel ourselves to be in. And these transitions are often characterized historically, as we look back, by war, by economic crisis, by geopolitical shifts, by new military alliances, by the collapse of existing structures, and they are often characterized by striking expressions of discontent. But they are also characterized by new literary and artistic forms, new technological mediums. They are creative moments as well. And living through them, as we know from our own experience right now, particularly since COVID, can feel profoundly disorientating. The sheer speed of change. I like to think of these moments of transition as molten moments, like lava, when the existing system becomes malleable. And of course, malleability is a wonderful thing, because in a moment, in a molten moment, there is a capacity to reshape the landscape in ways that are fundamental. They're high-stakes moments historically, because the outcome of them is not predetermined. So they offer a possibility of genuine agency, for better and, of course, for worse. Now, for the church, these molten moments, these transitions are paradigmatic changes in the missional environment. And they require new things of the people of God. They feel often, for the church, like having the rug pulled from under our feet. And they involve genuine loss. But they also offer, as we've seen and captured a moment of in the video we just watched, profound missional opportunity. And at these moments, seeing the landscape is really, really important. Because we're in unfamiliar terrain. We've never been this way before. Remember that story as the people of Israel about to cross the Jordan. We've never been this way before. The terrain is unfamiliar, and therefore we need to see the landscape in order to know how to navigate within it and also how to avoid what is exceptionally difficult circumstances in which to lead. And in fact, actually, historical examples make it clear that these transitional moments are also moments when the church is extremely vulnerable to the temptation to lead in very dangerous directions. They're high-stakes moments. So the way we interpret our context matters, because what's at stake here are our missional imaginations. Now, the context I want to look at really briefly this morning, and don't worry because this is not a history lecture, although there are times when I veer into history lecturing, and Paul will grin at me if I do that. I just want us to look really, really briefly at Britain since 1960, and I'm going to try and sketch out the main contours of the landscape to help us see ourselves in context. For at least 3 generations, there's been contention amongst scholars. We know this, Christian scholars as well as secular scholars, over how to name the period since 1960. Some people call it the secular age. Some people call it the era of the sexual revolution. Some like to call it late 20th century or late modern period. Other people prefer to use the term postmodern period. Some people call it post-Christian. Some people are even dubbing it post-secular. The very fact that we're struggling to name this is symptomatic of the fact that we are in a degree of fog. It's really hard to pin down. However, in the last few years since COVID, many of the things that we've been struggling to see clearly, the longer-term factors that have been rumbling away under the surface of our culture, have started to come sharply into focus. Almost that liminal moment when you come out of fog and you suddenly see sharply. It's a shocking moment. We're in that moment right now. And long-term change is suddenly catalyzed into sharp, dramatic change that feels like, as Paul said, that it's speeding up. And suddenly, I think we're no longer post, we're right on the cusp of part 2. And let me explain what I mean by part 2. The period since 1960 is, I think, best described as a revolutionary landscape. A revolution is not just a coup, it's an active movement of resistance within a culture. It's not just a long-term process of incremental change. Now, of course, all revolutions... Oh, I've done the slide the wrong way. Still, I haven't got used to the clicker. Sorry about that. Here we go. All revolutions have an initial period of overthrow, a period of reaction against something, but they're followed by another movement where the early idealism wears off and you see the imposition and the construction of a new regime. We see this in Russia in 1924 after Lenin dies and Stalin comes to power. We see it in France after the terror and Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power. And we see it in that really important revolution, Animal Farm by George Orwell, when the pigs start wearing clothes and walking on 2 feet instead of 4. There are movements within a single revolutionary movement, and they have to be understood in 2 parts, I think, rather than 1. The rise of a new cultural matrix, as well as the decline of an old one. And in British culture, part 1 was a dislocation from a predominantly Christian milieu, a rejection of the relationship between Christianity and culture that existed in Britain more or less since the middle of the 18th century, right through the modern period. Now, my grandparents and my parents lived through this dislocation. And as a member of Gen X, I was raised right in the heart of this moment of active resistance, a rejection of the Christian legacy in the West. And through most of my growing up, my early adult years, right through to the late 1990s, and I think around until 2008, that's actually pretty specific, isn't it? We can come back to the dates if you like. The culture was still characterized by continuity, by many of the forms of language, many of the presuppositional categories and assumptions that were part of and drawn from the Christian era. Part one reacted against the Christian legacy, but it also lived on the good of those presuppositional frameworks of the Christian tradition. But part two, the period since 2008, it's emerged out of part one. We need to see it as one movement, but a shift, a crucial shift, right in the heart of this process. It started in the womb of part one, but once it was formed, it was no longer just a reaction, no longer simply borrowing from the languages and forms of the Christian era, but actually it represents a unique cultural form in its own right, a radical disjunction from the relationship that existed in British society in the period before 1960. Now, my own work, and I'm going to skim over this, my own work, research work, is really focused on how that impacts ideas of gender and sexuality. We can come back to that again. But what I want us to see here is very simple. The revolution that began in the 1960s has now given rise to a new cultural matrix with its own distinctive value system, with its own metaphysical framework, and with its own approach to reality. It's a new missional environment, a new moment, one that's not the same as most of us grew up in, that most of us were formed and discipled in, that most of us had our missional imaginations shaped by. So I just want to pull out three major themes. And I don't have a watch, so I'm reliant on the thumbs up, thumbs down of my husband. Okay, three themes. First, I want to go right to the bedside of children in the 1960s. And research shows that during the very late 1950s and 1960s, a really important change happened. Mothers stopped praying with their children at night. What a small thing, and what a big thing. At the same time, they stopped sending their children to Sunday school, and the previous patterns of intergenerational transmission of the Christian faith broke down. Now, they did so as a facet of women's renegotiation, that reconfiguring, the gender revolution of women's social, cultural, political identities. That's complex and multi-layered. But what it amounted to was a shift away from the generative transmission of moral and cultural forms. And this shift was central to the rise of what has come to be known as no religion. Now, this phase, no religion, is quite good because it captures something really important. Not just a decline, but the rise of something else. Not just a tailing off of religious practices, but the rise of a new mainstream culture, new subtle identity markers, new patterns and habits and behaviors in the culture that were an active rejection of the identity markers of a previous generation. It was a shift in milieu from a landscape in which Christianity sat right at the center to a landscape in which no religion begins to dominate the center ground. If you think about it as contours in a landscape, that's a massive tectonic shift. It's a replacement of cultural Christianity with another substantive cultural expression. And from the 1960s onwards, these no-religionists become vast in number. They start to reshape the mainstream. Now, for the secularists of the late 20th century, and no religion is not the same as secularism, and it's certainly not the same as secularists. This rise of no religion was, for the secularists, the ideologues of this revolution, the best thing that ever happened to British culture. And it was greeted as a glorious revolution that frees and releases Western culture, and especially women, from the shackles of an oppressive Christian past, permitting especially sexual freedom. But the problem is that this rise of no religion that we all know actually only describes part one of the revolutionary process. Because what seemed to be freeing from the vantage point of the late 20th century and the advent of true equality actually was far more complicated than the secular ideologues supposed. As it turned out, this widespread revolt against Christianity was actually producing its own social, cultural, and political fruit. And the fruit was not what secularism expected. The landscape itself was shifting. It wasn't static, it was actually dynamic. Even the term no religion that seemed to fit really well in the late 20th century actually is really archaic by the time you get to the early 20th century, because mass migration from other regions with historic faith traditions that were not Christian has become a vital characteristic of British life. And on the ground, since the 1960s, these immigrant communities have not simply, as many of the ideologues of the revolution expected, they haven't simply assimilated into the dominant hegemonic culture of Christian Britain, only to revolt against it and then become no religionists. Actually, many of these experiences of coming from somewhere else into the British experience has actually led to a defining and a redefining of strong and increasingly active religious identities, which are neither Christian nor no religion. And if we want to just use a shorthand, which is highly problematic, other religionists, they're pushing back in entirely new and unexpected ways against the social and political implications of no religion as a mainstream British value system. This is interesting, curious, unexpected. And these groups are forming very complicated, multi-layered sectional expressions of faith, which are becoming an important part of the civil discourse in the Western world, as well as beyond the Western world. And moreover, they are increasingly connected across vast distances on the globe. And these shifts are changing the fundamental nature of the polity. They are also undermining, and that's not quite the right word, it's a pejorative word, but they are also changing the foundational assumptions on which the idea of the nation state has been based since the 18th century. This is a massive change. And the notion that any hegemonic identity structure, such as the nation state, might or should prevail to determine and ensure one kind of social or moral identity over another, that's alien in this reconfigured world of part two. It's ancient history. And the challenges of plurality, they are no longer peripheral. They're actually central to the landscape. This is a really significant shift, and it's going to reshape our missional environment moving forward. But there's a second factor as well, and that's globalization. Now, we all know, don't we, that globalization is basically the dominant theme of the period since 1960. It's the biggest change. It's often the biggest changes that we forget to talk about. We'll come to another of those in a minute. It's changing, globalization is changing the internal cultures of nations as well as the relationships between nations. Nation states are internally transforming from the grassroots up, but they are also repositioning in new kinds of geopolitical alliances within the global political economy. That's really significant. There's been profound geopolitical realignment since 1960 in ways which my grandparents could not have imagined. Decolonization. Now, decolonization wasn't just a set of events after the Second World War. It was a cultural movement, a long-term shift in perspective, a fundamental change in the dynamics of cultural as well as political power, hence that intimidating term, which we don't need to be intimidated by, post-colonial theory. A re-evaluation of the political and cultural supremacy of modern Western perceptions. This is more than a change of mood. It's a change of vantage point. And as a historian, it's really interesting to me that the word globalization comes into common parlance in the 1960s, along with other important words like gender and pluralism. And the word means this process that we're familiar with of interlinking, integrating, particularly markets and labor markets across the globe. But it's not just economic. We can't simply live in that dimension. It's also, as I've just said, is political. It's about diplomacy. It's about law. It's about policing. It's increasingly about surveillance. It's international administrative power. It's also about international policy. It's about scaling up in order to resolve major global issues like pandemics and environmental crises. But it's also cultural. It's about symbols, it's about meaning, it's about language transferring across vast distances almost instantaneously. Dislodging cultural production from the locality and moving it up into another terrain and across. And in these layers, the constraints of geography, and this is really what I want us to see because it's deeply formative for our experiences missionally on the ground. The restraints of geography start to recede. They recede in people's cultural identity, people's sense of self. Place becomes less and less important. My parents lived their whole lives just a few miles from where they were born. That is so rare. Gen X, we were the first to leave to go to university. There was something shocking about how far away we were going, an hour and a half and 2 hours down the road. Grandmothers weeping. People's sense of self is being lifted out of place. And of course, thirdly, we have to talk about digital revolution, the other elephant in the room. And elephants in the room are elephants in the room because we forget to talk about them and see them. This is adding a phenomenological layer to the globalization process. Now, phenomenology is not an intimidating thing. It just simply means the study of people's experiences of reality. Really the study of consciousness. And in part one of the revolution, globalization creates this different relationship between human society and place, those constraints of geography receding. But in part two, globalization takes even deeper root via digital mediums. And individual consciousness is increasingly dislocated from the physicality of the body. And as society begins to access community primarily through technology, as communities mediated through technology, not through physical touch, not through embodied interactions in daily, ordinary life, it changes the relationships that people have with their bodies, with materiality itself. And people's sense of self begins to be reformulated in much the same way that previously was dislocated from place. And in part two, virtuality is fast becoming, and we all know this, And part of what we're doing today is saying what we already know, to lay it out in an orderly way in front of us to help us navigate. But what virtuality is doing, fast becoming the central site for the formation of identity and experience, including and perhaps most importantly, sexual identity, particularly among young people. When identity ceases to be a matter of physically embodied presence in the community, face-to-face relationship that happen in actual places, and it's formed in the consciousness, technology starts to insert itself between the mind and the body. And in new, unique ways, it separates consciousness and materiality. Internet pornography is on the leading edge of the emerging and hypersexualized cultural landscape of Part 2. Pornography is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. It's one of the fastest growing industries on the planet. And it's colonizing the phenomenological landscape. It's colonizing the landscape of Part 2, which is rapidly becoming normative for all of us. It's a luxury we can no longer afford to say, pornography is not my issue. And in an acute way, internet pornography fragments personhood. I'm using it here to illustrate the point. When sex is divorced from materiality, it begins to change the relationship between the mind and the body within the individual, not just between individual human beings. This is really important because we carried on using a modernist critique of pornography in part 1, and we still use that critique. Pornography is problematic because it turns a woman in particular into an object to be consumed by a man. But that critique doesn't make any sense in the new landscape of Part 2. Because in this new world, all selfhood is objectified on the screen. All selfhood is placed and curated to be consumed. And this metaphysical universe is actually made up of objects driven and moved by desires. Part 1, it was all about choices. Part 2, it's all about desires. And they collide with one another as desiring objects. This is a universe, Part 2, in which subjectivity and objectivity is beginning to collapse. And in this new landscape where presence is mediated through technology, it's entirely plausible to imagine oneself aside from any of the material referent points, including the biological referent point of the body. So choosing one's personal pronoun makes absolute sense. It's entirely plausible. Actually, more than that, it is necessary. Because identifying one's sexuality in the broadest sense actually becomes the mediation point between the personal and the social, between the communal and the political. And identifying one's sexual preferences, particularly for our young people, this becomes an integral and necessary part of participation in society, a necessary part of identifying who we are. And globalization undermines local identity at the macro scale, but look what's happening. At the micro scale, personal, individual identity is emphasized of paramount importance. Scaling up and scaling down. It's creating extremes at every level of the culture. And that's deep in the instability that we're experiencing. Our culture's moving in two divergent directions at once. In the last 10 years, we've seen unprecedented centralization of power at a global level, and at the same time, very same time, we've seen this extraordinary stress on extreme personal autonomy, this hyper-expressive individualism. But between these two extremes, in the middle ground, where once there was the family, the church, and the nation state, layered communities of identity within which the lone individual could belong, this center ground has been stripped away. And the scale of the individual relative to these overarching political units leaves lone individuals more vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation than they've ever been before. And it isn't surprising, is it? That the biggest single factor that people are expressing as we move to this threshold in part 2 is endemic loneliness. A deep sense of loneliness and alienation, of disconnection, but it's also disconnection from the material world, including from the materiality of our own bodies. So as we approach this threshold, these deep inconsistencies are beginning to come to the surface. And in our disorientation, let me make a few points and I'll finish. In our disorientation, our society is fragmenting into tribes. People have to find somewhere to belong. And we too are in danger of turning on each other as we try to grapple with this change. Some of us are entrenching into idealized versions of the past. We'll talk more about that later. And some of us are assimilating into new cultural norms, unwilling and unprepared, totally unprepared for what might be involved in being a Christian in this strange new world. But meanwhile, our surrounding culture is in crisis, in desperate need of the good news of the gospel. And as I look back at the long history of Christianity, I love doing that. I just have to pause for a minute because I tell you that one of the great joys of my life is being immersed in that long story of who we are as a people of God. I see many times when the church has faced sudden, rapid, catalytic changes, sudden changes in the missional environment, moments when the rug is pulled, when a societal threshold has to be crossed, whether we like it or not. And at such times, the people of God have had to rediscover their fundamental identity in Christ all over again. How are we going to respond?
We're going to have a moment for some discussion, some questions, some comments. I hope we've got some roving mics that are getting ready. In this session, we've built on Pope Francis' idea that we're approaching a change of era, a societal threshold, not simply an evolutionary or linear change, but the kind of change that accelerates, that is a paradigmatic shift, and that needs to be approached with a high degree of missional intentionality and alertness. And Sarah's described this landscape as a revolutionary one, a revolution in two parts. And notice the two ways in which what's been emphasized is the possibility of agency. It's easy to feel, in the light of all the things that are being laid out here, that we have no ability to influence. But actually, there is real opportunity for agency and intentionality, even though change is speeding up. Our influence and our agency can have more effect because this moment is malleable. There's not a predetermined outcome. This is the experience we're in right now, and it challenges us to dig deep into our identity in Christ. And we need to look to Jesus, as we've started with today. What is he doing? Fixing our gaze on him, because, as Joshua told the people who were about to cross the River Jordan, look at the Ark of the Covenant. Then you'll know which way to go, since you have never been this way before.